Dialogue at the Wilson Center is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And now here's your host, John Molesky.
Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we convene our Security Roundtable to discuss the best ways to deal with outlier states. Specifically, we'll focus our attention on North Korea and Iran. Our guests are Haleh Esfandiari, Director of the Wilson Center's Middle East Program, Robert Hathaway, Director of the Wilson Center's Asia Program, and Robert Litwak, Vice President for Scholars and Academic Relations and Director of International Security Studies at the Wilson Center. Welcome to the discussion. Thanks for joining us. Rob, you wrote the book, Outlier States. I have a copy right here, so I have physical evidence. Just talk us through the theory of how we name states and the progression from the rogue state designation to the states of interest designation to what we prefer today, the outlier states.
Well, President Obama has referred to Iran and North Korea as outliers, states that are flouting their obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And when he used the term, White House aides stated that it was a deliberate departure from the George W. Bush era moniker of rogue state. And rogue carried the connotation of states that are beyond the pale, irredeemable, essentially. Whereas outlier, the term connoted the possibility that these states could be reintegrated into the international community if they came into compliance with their international obligations.
And are there any states that still would fall into that rogue state classification, or are we into an era where we're looking at engagement or potential rehabilitation?
Well, rogue was a unilateral American political concept, and I think the Obama administration viewed that as having the liabilities that flowed from that derivation. The outlier term has been used in the nuclear context with respect to the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel, Pakistan, and India are nuclear weapon states and are outside the treaty, and they exercise their sovereign right as states not to join the NPT. So Iran and North Korea, which are such different states in so many ways, are treated under the outlier rubric because unlike Israel, India, and Pakistan that didn't sign up, so to speak, for the deal, Iran and North Korea were inside the treaty and have been cheating within it, and that's why they're dealt with in that way.
One of the other aspects, qualifications for the rogue state designation you write about in the book is states that are pursuing weapons of mass destruction, notably nuclear weapons, and also sponsoring terrorism. Right. What has happened to that configuration?
Well, the United States has a state sponsor of terrorism list. The Secretary of State annually will designate such states. The list has been useful as a way of prodding states to give up state-sponsored terrorism, which is a declining phenomenon, by the way. The list has itself been politicized, and there are countries on it. Cuba, for example, remains on the state-sponsor list, but has not been actively engaged in it. So it's been problematic. Iran remains the leading sort of state sponsor of terrorism in the sense that it uses terrorism as an asymmetrical instrument vis-a-vis the outside world.
Haleh, before North Korea began rattling the saber pretty regularly, Iran and its pursuit of nuclear weapons was dominating headlines in this classification of news. This notion of being an outlier state, do the Iranians understand how they're viewed, and do they care?
I'll take you a step back to when Iran was mentioned among the rogue state. Mm-hmm. They truly were very much offended by that classification, and it was during a time when the Iranians were trying to reach out to the United States, and they were then slammed with being the rogue state. Somehow they are taking the outlier state slightly better, and basically it didn't change their position regarding the nuclear issue. It did not. I mean, you can call them whatever name you want. They continue with their program. But as I said, rogue state offended them. Outlier state, they just ignored.
In general, is there any sense that the regime cares at all about public opinion outside of Iran or even within Iran?
Sure, they are aware of public opinion outside Iran. I mean, they are aware. I mean, look what the sanctions are doing to Iran. The sanctions are the result of their nuclear program. And the Iranian people are suffering from the sanctions economically. But this has not changed their position when it comes to continuing with their nuclear program. But on the other hand, they continue saying we are willing to sit and talk. And just today, the Iranian foreign minister announced that, we welcome what Secretary of State Kerry said, and we are more than happy to continue talking, to the P5+1. And they are going also on May 15, they are going to meet with IAEA technicians to see to continue they call it quote-unquote cooperation with the IAEA.
And Bob, the case of North Korea, outlier state number 2 or number 1A or some configuration, about this notion of do they care about how they're viewed around the world? And if so, does it in any way affect their behavior?
Well, it's sort of, John, a yes and no response. They do care. They particularly care about places like China, because they're so dependent upon China. On the other hand, it clearly seems from their rhetoric, from their continually provocative behavior, that they don't really care what anybody thinks. I think it's very difficult to make the case that outside of opinion, even from China, really influences their behavior very, very much.
About this harsh rhetoric that we've seen, and there have been some signs of moderation in the last couple days, but who is the primary audience for that? Is that a domestic audience within North Korea that the regime is playing to, or are they playing to the rest of the world?
Well, again, all of the above. And let's start by specifying we really don't have a very clear understanding about what North Korean intentions and motivations are. The country is still going through a very delicate political transition, notwithstanding the fact that the current leader, Kim Jong-un, assumed power in December of 2011, more than a year ago, but the process itself is still ongoing. There are within the North Korean government and the North Korean military various factions, and I'm sure that some of the bombastic rhetoric that we've heard is very much a reflection of domestic politics. Among other things, the young Kim, I'm quite sure, is trying to shore up his credentials with the military. But I think there's also a very important domestic audience. North Korea has a long history, not just in the last year or two, really going back for a quarter century, has a long history of every time it feels like it's being ignored by the outside world, and specifically by the world's largest, strongest power, the United States, it engages in pretty over-the-top rhetoric and with some
gets our attention.
Actions, exactly, in order to get our intentions as in an effort to get us to re-engage with the North diplomatically.
In this regard, does North Korea represent in many ways the toughest nut to crack? It seems like we know more about Iran than we know about North Korea. Is of all these nations that we're talking about that might qualify for the outlier designation, is this the toughest one to understand?
Well, I think different people might answer that in different ways, but it's clearly the case that North Korea is the most isolated country in the world, and in that sense, we know less about it, we understand less about it, and we probably have fewer ways to influence its behavior.
Rob, in terms of threat perception, the way we perceived threat in the Cold War was different from the way we perceive threat post-Cold War and then certainly post-9/11. Where are we now in that regard as it relates to concerns about these so-called outlier states, or maybe other threats, things like leakage from states that are like Russia or Pakistan that may be less secure, or at least that's the fear that their nuclear arsenals could be less secure?
I think the conventional wisdom, which is accurate, is that the threat of large-scale nuclear war between major powers is low and has been low since the end of the Cold War. That's the good news. The bad news is that an individual weapon might be used either by a state or more likely by a non-state actor. And this really points to the pathway of terrorist acquisition, which you alluded to in your question, namely leakage, that a state would inadequately secure its nuclear weapons. And here attention focuses on Pakistan and Russia as particularly problematic, and that would be a pathway for terrorist acquisition. But I think we do need to have some perspective on the challenges posed by Iran and North Korea. North Korea it's hard to estimate, but a GDP of $40 billion. Iran is about $330 billion. The GDP of the United States, 15 trillion. European Union, 15 trillion. So these are not major powers, Germany, Soviet Union, China, that could pose a systemic threat. They are challenges in their region, but they can't collapse the system, so to speak. And I think that we need to keep the challenge posed by them in perspective.
Are we looking for, in the case of North Korea and Iran, are we looking for regime change or behavior of the regime change?
Well, in the case of North Korea, that's an ongoing debate in Washington. The previous administration, George W. Bush administration, frequently highlighted the necessity of regime change with the argument that it's unrealistic to expect this regime to change its behavior, therefore you have to change the regime. Others would suggest that if in fact you tell the North Koreans you're not going to deal with them until they, quote, reform themselves or conform to our standards, what incentive do we give them for any sort of responsible behavior? So it's still a debate here in town.
What about the case of Iran? Can the Ayatollah come around, and can Iran become part of the so-called community of nations?
Well, I think Iran is part of the community of nations. Otherwise, the P5+1 have not been negotiated, have not negotiated with them.
What I mean,
let me just take you from
Understood.
Iran.
Correction accepted.
Yeah, and don't forget that Iran has relations with every country except with the United States. So all the embassies have representatives in Iran. Iran is an active member of the United Nations. Iran is an active member of all these commissions. But the idea that, threat of regime change will change their behavior, I don't think so. I mean, there are those in this town and other even European towns who think one should push for regime change. I think for 33 years they have tried that and it hasn't worked. But the sanctions, my read is that the sanctions are working. And this is why, once in a while, we see there is a push among the technocrats in Iran to convince the supreme leader to allow them to go and negotiate, hoping that there will be a package that will be acceptable to the supreme leader. One of the possible, potential candidates of the upcoming presidential elections in Iran who is the current mayor of Tehran, very popular, former commander of the Revolutionary Guard, and so gave a very interesting interview yesterday. He said, at the end of the day, it's the supreme leader who decides what Iran's foreign policy is going to be and what the nuclear negotiations are going to lead us. But the president can make a difference. And he reached out more than any other presidential candidate so far to the outside world. So maybe there is going to be an opening and we will come to some sort of an understanding.
One of the things that's clear from any analysis that goes beyond the surface, and certainly our discussion today, is that there's no one-size-fits-all scenario for any of the countries we might be talking about. And Rob, help me out with this. Confrontation is one way, engagement is another way, containment is another way. Is there another thing I should add to the list? Are those the three major options?
Well, bomb, squeeze, engage are sort of the range of options there. But let me just pick up on Haleh's point, and it builds on Bob's comment as well, is that with both of these countries, and they're so different, and sort of categorizing them and even under the same kind of discussion is so problematic, other than in the specific context of the nuclear question that puts them at odds with the major powers on the Security Council, is that although the contexts are wildly different, in each country, it seems, from kind of an outside comparative perspective, there is a similar dynamic where the nuclear issue has become a proxy for the broader question of what kind of relationship these states want with the outside world. And here we have kind of contending pathways that have been evident. If you look at the recent developments in Burma and Serbia, with the Kosovar deal that was announced just recently regarding Serbia. In Serbia and Burma, the ruling regimes, their strategic calculus shifted such that reaching a diplomatic workout with the Kosovars in the case of Serbia and the case of Burma, opening itself up and not becoming so reliant on the Chinese and opening up commercial possibilities. That shift in the core interest groups of the regime led to them to choose a different path. And the question with respect to Iran and North Korea is, if sufficient pressure and inducements are brought to bear, can we shift the calculus of decision in those countries so that they would kind of resolve the nuclear issue and lead to the kind of a different sort of outside relation?
You have a thought on that, Haleh?
I even don't want to compare the two countries together because Iran is not isolated while North Korea is isolated.
Right. We're specifically, the tie that binds is the one Rob identified, the nuclear question, which could have such devastating consequences. It's worth looking at it in that
course.
Way.
Look, and the big difference is that North Korea has the bomb, Iran does not have the bomb. So this is the main difference between these two countries. A couple of weeks ago, everybody was worried that what if they throw the bomb? What if they use the bomb?
Right.
Iran doesn't have. What we are concerned is, when is Iran going to cross that red line?
And what if they get the bomb?
So so I think that makes it a big difference. And also, Iran is, again I repeat, Iran is not isolated, John. Iran has relations with the rest of the world, and that's why it makes it more difficult for the regime to justify the sanctions to its own people.
Before we're down to our final couple minutes, and I'm always intrigued by the notion of focusing on the trend lines versus the headlines, and particularly when you've had such the crazy rhetoric coming out of North Korea, it's easy to focus on those charged headlines. But if we could have each of you, in about 30 seconds each in our remaining time, talk about the trend lines in this regard, where we see movement. Rob, you began to touch on that in your last response. Bob, what, particularly as it relates to North Korea, what are the trend lines telling us?
The big question is, can the North be induced, bribed, paid, persuaded to abandon a nuclear weapons arsenal and aspirations for such an arsenal, or is it impossible to walk them back? Rob quite rightly said that in addition to coercion, there should be inducements. And I think one difference between Iran and North Korea right now is that most of the North Korea experts, both here and in Europe and in Asia, fear that North Korea cannot be walked back. And that gets me to simply the U.S. side of it. For 4 years, the United States government has largely ignored North Korea on the assumption that you let them know that there are better alternatives for them, but you let them come to their own decision. Clearly hadn't worked. I think at some point we do have to re-engage with them, but I think it's important that we do so at a time and under circumstances of our own choosing, not simply in response to ill-tempered rhetoric and behavior.
Forgive me for doing this, but time is very tight. About 10 or 15 second quick thought on the trend lines as it relates to Iran and the larger questions.
Using the words that Bob used, the question is, can Iran be induced to at least suspend its program for a couple of years, maybe for 5 years, to give a chance to see whether the West will come up with delivering the promises that they have been making in bringing Iran, in taking Iran away from its nuclear program.
Quick final thought, Rob.
Well, the nuclear issue is this proxy for the question of the broader relationship of these countries with the outside world. North Korea's nuclear program is more advanced than Iran's, but Iran is viewed as the more dynamic threat because of its oil revenues and its radical ideology.
Okay. Thanks. The book is Outlier States. I'll do a plug for your book before we leave. It's more comfortable if I do that instead of you. Thanks for joining us. After the break, we'll hear from one of North America's leading authorities on cyber threats concerning efforts by Canada and the U.S. to protect the continent's power grid. Right after this.
The Wilson Center is America's living memorial to its 28th president, connecting the world of policymaking to practical options derived from the world's finest ideas, research, analysis, and honest, nonpartisan conversation. Visit us on the web at wilsoncenter.org. And now we return to more dialogue at the Wilson Center.
Welcome back. When it comes to significant cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, many experts believe it's a matter of when and not if one will succeed. Our guest is on the front lines of efforts to protect the North American power grid from such an attack. Mark Fabro, SC Magazine's 2011 Information Security Professional of the Year, provides context.
Lofty Perch is it's an engineering center of excellence for cybersecurity as it relates to industrial automation. By that I mean the computers, the IT systems that run the critical infrastructure sectors, power, water, critical manufacturing, pipelines. The computers that run those systems are known as industrial control systems. So we specialize specifically on cybersecurity assessments, remediation practices for those systems. That is a great question. I think that there is a bit of a misperception or a misunderstanding about the level of communication between Canada and the U.S. and Mexico, for that matter, because of the nature of the grid, the dependency, the communications. There are no borders. I firmly believe that the communications between Canada and the U.S. from an owner-operator infrastructure perspective is very sound. I believe that those that sit at the table that are from Canadian asset owners and U.S. asset owners, that especially along the border, they know each other, they know who to call. This, even at the government level, seems to be working very, very well. We have to be reminded that right now we're dealing with cybersecurity issues, but the bulk power system in North America, what Canada and the U.S. as neighbors have had to try and manage over the years through blackouts and ice storms and things like this, the bulk power system has been very, very resilient, and there's been a lot of things that have had to happen that have made this binational cooperation be very effective. And it's ongoing, even though we're talking about cybersecurity now. I think that one of the key thrusts in trying to enhance the cybersecurity of the North American bulk power system is clearly around information sharing, and that might not necessarily be between asset owners and asset owners or countries to countries. There is information about possibly imminent attacks or threats that relates to specific elements of the bulk power system. So when I say information sharing, I am talking about being able to optimize the way government gets the private sector, who owns most of the critical assets in North American critical infrastructure, how government can optimize the path to get the pertinent need-to-know information to the asset owners, and also how the asset owners can get pertinent need-to-know information up to government, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, what it's going to be. At the government level, communication works well, I think. At the asset owner level, communication works well. It's the exchange of information between the public and private sector that needs to be enhanced. And we have to understand that these organizations are working very hard to do that. There are decades and decades and decades of traditional issues that would prevent easy private public cooperation. Now, when push comes to shove, when we're talking about securing something as important as the North American bulk power system, both private sector and public sector are working very hard to figure out what those information sharing mechanisms need to be. And we're seeing some great successes. That is a really good question. As a researcher, I would obviously want to say, oh, we're never going to see enough funding towards being able to figure out how we stay one step ahead. I think we're doing a really good job in terms of understanding how to get access to the right information and interpret it in terms of how we need to protect the bulk power system. We do make mistakes along the way, right? We do make mistakes because we have, with so much research that's happening right now, where you have individual, very clever researchers finding vulnerabilities in field equipment in certain systems. As a community, we're making a bit of an error in extrapolating those single vulnerabilities and extending them to be entire systemic issues. And we have to be careful about that because there's hype involved and there's some sort of attractiveness to say, ooh, this system that we found vulnerable is involved in bulk power system operations, ergo the bulk power system is now totally vulnerable. We have to be careful about that. When you ask the question, is enough being done? No, not right now, but the people who are responsible for doing enough are aware that not enough is being done. That in itself is I think, progress. When you have the North American Electric Reliability Corporation working with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, working with the Canadian Electricity Association, coming together saying, we know what we need to do, we're not doing it, how do we get there? I think that funding is finding its way into the scheme. I think that the cooperative relationships between public and private sector are absolutely making a difference. Are we at the point where we are ahead of the curve? No, I don't know when that's actually going to be, and I don't know if it would be correct for me to say, yeah, we are going to be ahead of the bad guys. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but I think that we are rapidly approaching getting much better at knowing what it is we need to be doing and how we need to be doing it.
New editions of Context can be found each week at wilsoncenter.org, and previous episodes are available at wilsoncenter.org/context. That's all for this edition of Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Until next week, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Television and Radio. Our host's Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Molesky. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.